This is Daniel Simon from Baton Rouge Community College. This is my week 3 history podcast on the Industrial Revolution and the rise of socialism. This will be a part 1 of 2 lectures this week on the 19th century predominantly. This week, of course, I'm first talking about the Industrial Revolution, which happened mostly in the 18th and 19th centuries up to about World War I. And the Industrial Revolution was something that started mostly in Great Britain in the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution was different from other revolutions that were more political and so on. This one was more economic, social type revolution, which revolutionized the way economies were run in states. It led to the rise of capitalism. And before, I guess, the 18th century, most of your types of economies were mostly based off of hand production of goods. Like everything was pretty much produced by hand, whether it be raising crops or making shoes or anything that they produced in the old days. And eventually in the 18th century, people began to mass produce goods using like new technologies, manufacturing. They used new kinds of machines and industries. And so that revolutionized the way things were produced over time. And then the Industrial Revolution eventually spread from Britain to the rest of Europe, then spread to the United States in the West, and then even spread eventually to what is Asia over time. So industrialization is obviously the key thing that happened. And I'll also talk about later how it also led to a lot of changes in agriculture, because you see mechanization there going on as well. Of course, if you look at the 18th century, they went from, like I said, producing things by hand. You start seeing steam power starts developing, which replaces things by hand. Eventually, go to electrical power and things like that. Also, even fuels changed as well. Like originally, at least up to like 1700, most of the type of main fuel people used was like wood or whale oil, things like that. Then that was eventually replaced by things like whale oil was replaced by kerosene. Of course, the big thing that replaced wood was coal, anthracite type coal. And that was a big change, of course, that happened with that. Also, between 1760 to 1840, which was an 80-year period, in Britain, there was a big increase in the way people live their lives. A lot of different changes in technologies and innovations. And that basically was an example of why the Industrial Revolution happened in different parts of Europe, like Britain and so on. Now, the Industrial Revolution began mostly, they say, in the mid-1700s in Britain. I think it mostly occurred like in the southern part of England and also parts of Scotland. And I'll kind of go through some of the major factors that, I guess, contributed to the Industrial Revolution starting. One was in agriculture. They had a lot of changes that happened in Britain, which was part of the British agricultural revolution. The first thing that happened, of course, was they had what they call the enclosure movement that happened around the 18th century, though I think it happened before that, like going back to the 1700s. And the land in Britain began to be controlled by a lot of wealthy landowners, and the land was eventually enclosed into large farmlands over time. And so very fewer people owned land, so a lot of people later would have to leave the countryside and move to the cities to find work. That led to urbanization down the line. And they had to basically, these farmers, they had to try to find ways to produce crops or, I guess, raise cattle more scientifically. And so that led to innovations in farming. And so scientific farming kind of took off in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that's what led to the whole British agricultural revolution. It started around the 18th and 19th centuries. And so scientific farming followed next. And examples of things that changed, of course, with scientific farming was the development of agricultural machinery was the big thing that occurred. I think the first example they always talk about is the seed drill that was developed by Jethro Tull, who was an agriculturalist and English farmer in the early 1700s. And the seed drill was a type of machinery that could, with horse-drawn machine, they could plant crop seed mechanically instead of by hand. And that basically saved a lot of labor-intensive care and also less wages they had to pay out. So that was like the first thing that was first developed. That was then followed by, of course, I'll also talk about mechanical. They had mechanical machines that would thresh, like reap and thresh, crops. Like a mechanical reaper was a type of machine, I think originally drawn by horses, that could, cut the wheat or whatever. And then they had these reaper machines that would, excuse me, not reaper, thresher machines, mechanical thresher machines that would separate the seed from the stalk, etc. And that would produce that aspect of, harvesting grain. And there are different machines that were produced. I think I have one example of Cyrus McCormick. He's American, though, but McCormick, his famous company now called International Harvester, I think you call it now, was one of the first I know in America to produce a lot of these types of machines that would, produce, harvest, crop grain and so on. Crop rotation systems. Yeah, that was another thing that, of course, was famous about the agricultural revolution. Before, like going back to the Middle Ages, like in Britain and Europe, they had what they call the open field system, where a lot of times, like certain fields would lay fallow during the year. Well, they stopped doing that. They went to like a 4-field crop rotation system, which there was actually a guy named Charles Townsend who I believe lived around the 17th century. He popularized it and later became known as the Norfolk 4-course crop rotation system, although like it was called the 4-field crop rotation system for short, or 4-field system if you want. And what they did was they used all 4 fields at the same time. And what they did was they would rotate what they call fodder crops with regular crops. So they might have 2 fields that might have like barley and wheat or something or some other crop, and then on the fodder crops they would use like clover or turnips, etc. That would help to revitalize the soil, and then they could also feed it to cattle, and that would be able to produce higher crop yields and also produce better cattle, especially more heavier cattle, which could produce more beef, etc. So that led into selective breeding too, which they also started doing as well. So you can throw that in there. It's another thing that was different about the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, Charles Townsend was sometimes called Turnip Townsend because he pushed the idea of people growing turnips with these fodder crops. But they also use clover and other different types of fodder crops. Yeah, John Deere, I think I mentioned sometimes him. Of course, one thing that was big in the 18th century was the Dutch improved on the Chinese plow. So the Chinese invented the plow, I believe, a long time ago. And so originally they had iron plows, and then by the late 1800s, because of the development of steel production, John Deere, who was an American industrialist, developed some of the first steel plows he mass-produced, and that was actually originally what he was known for before he started developing also agricultural machinery, like tractors and all that as well. Transportation systems are also important too in the this period as well. The agricultural Revolution and also Industrial Revolution. And so a lot of states began to develop canals throughout their country to move goods to market. They also built better road systems, highways. Of course, railroads, like in the 1800s, becomes a big thing. And then steamships. The age of sail kind of ends, and steam power is used in naval and merchant marine type stuff. So you've got the development of steamships that start to develop after that. Preservation of food, of course, is another thing. I don't really have that in there, but that is something that also is part of the agricultural revolution too, because they had to figure a way to preserve food to sell to markets. Some people started canning things, and as you know, I don't think much of a canned milk. They canned milk and all vegetables and stuff like that. And of course, refrigeration was something that started in the 1800s. Was with ice originally, and then over time they get better refrigeration over time. So we talked about improved livestock. I told you about selective breeding becomes a big thing. I know in England, livestock is something they had to produce more because the population boom was bigger. So that led to the raising of a lot of cattle and sheep. Sheep was a big thing because of wool production, selling of meat, lamb, and so on. And so that was a big thing, and a lot of that did kind of contribute to decreasing farm jobs because it doesn't take that many people to raise like cattle, so on. Fertilizers were also developed too. Also, manure, of course, the original one they used, but over time they figured out they used chemicals like sodium nitrates and things like that to grow better crops. So all of this is kind of changing things in the farming and industrialized world, and a lot of this contributed to, like with farm jobs declining, people had to move to the cities to find work, and so that led to urbanization. And that's where a lot of your factories and industries will end up being. It's mostly in a lot of these major cities, like in Britain and other countries. Some of the actual industries that start out, of course, that were famous, the textile industry, producing cloth. It's one area that really industrialized first. They created a lot of innovations that would influence other industries later. I'll get to that, like wool, linen, cotton were the main things that they produced predominantly. Also hemp as well. So those are areas. Iron, steel mills, of course, also big as well. Like those kind of industries. Shipbuilding, petroleum industries, will be because producing like fuel. I think kerosene eventually becomes the first big fuel that they start producing. Of course, coal mining, and then other manufacturing that they, of course, came out later with it. Let me first talk about the textiles industry a little bit too as well, because that was really the first, like I said, to industrialize. Starting in Britain, they started first producing wool a lot as cloth, but over time, linen and especially cotton became big. Cotton, plant, and cotton was, of course, mostly gotten from like the United States and India, at least in the 1800s, and there were a lot of different innovations and technologies that changed that with the cotton industry. One of the first they always talk about is the flying shuttle, which was produced in the 1730s, about 1733, by this Englishman named John Kay. Kay was actually a watchmaker originally, and he came up with this new machine that could produce cloth a lot faster. And before that, most women did most of the weaving of cloth at home using like spinning wheels. And the flying shuttle produced it more faster, and it cut time in half, and I think it also cut labor in half because I think it only took one person to actually do it. So that was considered the first innovation they had. And then James Hargreaves in 1764 came up with the spinning jenny, which spinning jenny was type of also cloth weaving machine that used a spinning wheel with it. Took the idea of, I guess, of the flying shuttle and merged with a spinning wheel. And it was even faster than the flying shuttle and could produce up to, I think later models could produce up to 80 threads at once of cloth, which is pretty good. And so both these were hand crank models that were first developed in the early, I guess, 18th century, and that changed a lot of things with, you know, the weaving of production of cloth. Then they started adding technologies like the water frame I'll mention by Richard Arkwright, invented about 1769. That was considered the first type of weaving machine that used water power as a source, and they used like water wheels originally, which were used like with mills and other factories and so on. And it was basically water powered, and it could produce cloth a lot quicker. And basically, what Arkwright came up with was he started using these machines, like a lot of them, in factories. He would build like some of the first textile mills, which would produce cloth in England, and then influenced other countries later. And so they think that Arkwright was the father of the textile factory, more or less. So they think that started like in the 1770s in England and then spread to other areas, like in probably Scotland and so on, and in France, etc., and United States on down the line. So the water frame was like a famous one that was the first mechanical one that was powered by some kind of source. They have a spinning mule. I don't know if that one's as important, but it was a hybrid type of spinning type machine that produced cloth that was developed by this guy named Samuel Crompton, 1779. And it was a hybrid of like two other machines, which I believe were the spinning jenny and the water frame. And it was very popular because apparently it ended up in, I think there were blueprints of that I think ended up in the United States, I know, later. And for some reason that became one of the most popular ones, at least in the 18th century originally. I don't know if that one's important. Well, the power loom is considered the most efficient one. That was developed by Edmund Cartwright, 1785. Power loom was, I think, originally probably water powered, but over time it was one of the first loom machines that produced cloth that was steam powered, and became one of the most famous in the world. They still use the power loom today to produce a lot of cloth. A lot of these are I think the flying shuttle still used today too, some places like in Asia. But that one became the most efficient one overall, and like I said, it's still used. Also the cotton gin, I guess I'll mention that one. Of course, that one might be the most famous one now that was developed. That one was developed in the late 18th century, 1793, by Eli Whitney. Whitney was an American inventor. He was originally known for producing gun locks for like gun manufacturers in the New England area. And he produced the cotton gin, which the cotton gin was this machine that could basically separate the cotton seed from the cotton boll mechanically. And that basically saved a lot of time with producing cotton, because before that it all had to be done by hand, removing the seed from the cotton boll. And for a long time, like they had cotton in the 18th century, but like cotton shirts, like probably this one, was like real expensive to produce. And so after the cotton gin was invented, it became more cheaper. So 1800s, cotton became the main big, cloth everybody wanted after that. And you either got it from the United States or from India, I think was the main areas where they had cotton the most. Of course, in the United States, it led to the increase in slavery, overall. And of course, some people think that the cotton industry was one thing that, led to the American Civil War, because a lot of the cotton planters wanted to protect slavery, which was, I guess, vital to producing it. And of course, in the southern United States, like here, it was like a one-crop industry. They didn't have too many other crops, that they had as much. Maybe indigo or rice or maybe sugarcane, but cotton was the big thing where people made a lot of money. Let me move on to talk about other things. Now, the Industrial Revolution, the big invention that developed in the 18th century was the steam engine. It, of course, revolutionized other industries later. And the steam engine was something that was first used in coal mines. Like water would get trapped on the bottom of a coal mine. And so they'd have to find some kind of way to get the water out. So this guy named Thomas Newcomen, who was an Englishman, invented this machine that could get water out of a coal mine. They'd pump it out using like steam, basically. I guess they would convert water to steam and get it out. And so that's how originally the steam engine was first used. It was actually the Newcomen engine. It was the first one ever built. It was kind of not very practical. It always broke down a lot. And this Scottish guy named James Watt, who worked for the University of Glasgow, it's in Scotland. He was like an engineer, and he made I think he made like mechanical stuff for them, and instruments and so on. And he basically looked at the Newcomen machine, and he built his own version, which became known as the they call it the Watt engine or Watt steam engine, which is what this is here. And used kind of like boiler technology where they converted water into steam and produced, energy to move it. And the Watt engine became really the most famous invention at the beginning of the whole Industrial Revolution. Watt went on to produce hundreds of these machines. And I think he became a millionaire later, Watt. So Watt's also, connected to the whole term watt that they use with electricity and all that, which is something they gave him later. And it produced what they call horsepower, so much horsepower, which I think Watt was the guy that came up with that term horsepower originally. So from there, what happened was the steam engine that was used in other industries. They started using it like with the locomotive, which the locomotive was developed in the early 1800s, which the locomotive originally was called in the 19th century the iron horse. It was mostly made of iron, and people compared it to horses because it was, I guess, so fast like a horse. And so the 19th century was called the Age of the Iron Horse, usually. And the British guy that invented it was Richard Trevithick, around 1804. He built the first locomotive. He called it, I believe, Catch Me Who Can, I think was what it was called. Yeah, Catch Me Who Can. And it's real slow, but it could pull like many tons, which was pretty impressive. And it ran on mechanical rails. Rails that were mostly iron originally and then later steel. And it was a high-pressure type steam engine that they used in locomotives. Original locomotives were steam locomotives before they went to diesel power in the 1900s. And then, like by the 1820s and 30s, they start building more of these machines. And of course, in England, they built the first railroad. That was, of course, the Liverpool and Manchester Railroad, which they believe was completed in 1830, which connected those two cities, Liverpool and Manchester. It was built by this man named George Stephenson. He was considered one of the first, I guess, railroad builders in the world. And George Stephenson was later called the father of the railways because he built the first railroad in the world. But also he was known for being the one that designed a lot of the railroad tracks that would be used, which was either called the standard gauge or they also call it the Stephenson gauge, which is like the width of the rails that were used on most locomotives, which is about 4 foot 8.5 inches, and about 2/3 of railroads today pretty much use that type of standard gauge. He had a son named Robert Stephenson who also was involved in the development of railroads, and his son Robert was known for developing some locomotives. The most famous was called the Rocket, which was built around, I think, 1829 or somewhere around that time. And the Rocket was considered to be one of the first great locomotives that was built. And the platform of what it was built on was pretty much standard of what a lot of locomotives would be built upon, including the width of the rails that it ran on was the same as the standard gauge that George Stephenson would eventually develop with Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Steamships followed, of course, too, with the idea of steam. And Robert Fulton, who was an American manufacturer, developed the first steamships in America. And he built this one up in New England, which is called the Claremont. The Claremont was built, I forget, 1807, I think was the year maybe when it was built. And it was considered the first commercial steamship. And early steamships used paddle wheels, which were either put on the stern of the ship or in the middle of the ship. And so steam engines acted to, basically move these paddle wheels that would act as propulsion. A lot of the ships still had sails in case they ran out of fuel or whatever. But that's pretty much how early steam power was. And I guess by the late 1800s, they went to propeller-type ships over time. So Robert Fulton was pretty important with that. Then you had Henry Bessemer. Bessemer was this British steel magnate that was the first to mass-produce steel. They later called him the Man of Steel, Henry Bessemer. And Bessemer had a company that began mass-producing steel in England by using what they call Bessemer converters or a Bessemer furnace. That's where they converted like pig iron into carbon iron, which is carbon steel. It was like a more of a purified version of iron, which was stronger and better. And they could pour it out with these furnaces and make whatever they want out of it. So the development of steel really changed a lot of things later in industries. It also changed warfare later. They started making everything out of steel. Telecommunications were also big in the 1800s, like Samuel Morse. And there's also a guy named Charles Wheatstone of England. Sam Morse was American, Charles Wheatstone was English. And both those developed the telegram, I think, around the 1830s. And the telegram became eventually the first type of telecommunications device that was first used. Like I told you, like in the Crimean War, the American Civil War, started using it a lot. So that revolutionized, the way people communicate. So you didn't necessarily have to mail a letter anymore, although people still did. The telephone was developed by Alexander Graham Bell around 1876. That was a new invention in telecommunications we have today. And Bell even developed the first company to do that, which was called the Bell Telephone Company, which monopolized it for a while. And over time, telephones have also been an influence. Guglielmo Marconi, actually Italian-American, but Marconi was known for popularizing what we call wireless radio, which took off next by the 1890s. And they usually consider Marconi to be the father of what we call radio. So they figured out that they could send radio waves and receive messages, and that led to the, like radio, like news and music that we have on radio today and all that. So that was also pretty important too. So those are the three biggest things: telegraph, telephone, and of course wireless telegraph with the radio, the big things that happened in the 1800s. I do have a few more that were kind of famous. This is more like in the Second Industrial Revolution, but you had the Wright brothers, of course, or Orville and Wilbur Wright, who were actually originally bicycle mechanics from Ohio, and they, of course, developed the first practical airplane, which they flew in 1903. It was called the Wright Flyer, and they flew it in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And the Wright brothers got into airplanes because they heard about gliders being developed at the time. They thought they could develop an airplane, and so that revolutionized transportation later. And by World War I, they started using them in warfare as well. Henry Ford, I just kind of mentioned him usually, famous American manufacturer of automobiles. He was famous for his Ford Motor Company for different reasons. One, he was the first to mass produce automobiles, especially the Model T. And he was famous for developing his automobiles through using like some type of assembly line, which he kind of helped develop the idea of the assembly line, where different workers would produce different parts of the car. And so that revolutionized the way they built cars. And the Model T, which was sometimes called the Tin Lizzie, became the first mass-produced vehicle, which they produced like almost 30 million of them by the 1920s. So yeah, the automobile is the big thing that you see with transportation, the second industrial revolution. I do mention Thomas Edison. I just kind of mention him because he kind of helped to create a lot of inventions that changed the world. And Edison, of course, was one of the most prolific inventors in American history, especially in the Second Industrial Revolution. And Edison was known as the Wizard of Menlo Park because a lot of people thought his inventions were magical. A lot of it was actually hard work and what he called perspiration. It's called the Wizard of Menlo Park because he had this inventor's workshop that he had in Menlo Park, New Jersey. And he and his scientists and all that would kind of develop different technologies, new innovations. And his probably biggest invention was the light bulb, or incandescent light bulb, which he popularized by the late 19th century. But he was also known for other inventions like the phonograph, the movie projector. I think was another big one he kind of came up with because they claim he started like Hollywood movies and all that. So he was pretty prolific in a lot of his inventions, and so all these new inventions and technologies, people's way of lives are improving, especially as you get more toward like the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. It's a big change from like the early 19th century in comparison. So like in the long run, we'll kind of talk for a few minutes like the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, things improved, like I said. That's one thing that came about. People became more wealthier. A lot of states became more urbanized overall. Created more jobs in the cities. And so you've got all these technical innovations. And of course, one thing like in Britain, United States, France, other countries, you start to see the rise of like a middle class more. That's one thing that you do see because people's wages and salaries start going up by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Like Henry Ford was actually paying his workers $5 a day, which in the early 1900s, which doesn't seem like much now, but back then that was a lot of money. And you start seeing improvements in working conditions. That takes a while, but that's something you do see, which a lot of that had to do with like unionization of workers and also legislation that was passed by different states that led to various improvements. Now, on the negative side, you had the bad thing, like in the 19th century, like employment of children was still kind of going on, even like up to the turn of the 20th century, where you had children as young as like 5 years old, maybe working factories and mines. But children working up to, 10, 15 years old, that was quite common. A lot of women working, pregnant women working in factories, which could be dangerous. A lot of your working hours were 12 to 15 hours a day, maybe more. So you pretty much work 6 days a week, usually only off on Sundays. So it won't be until later till they start, coming up with legislation that, forces people to work only 8 hours or 10 hours a week, originally. Um, yeah, so employment of women was kind of harmful, especially pregnant women. Because of that, 1 in 5 infants born to women working in factories usually died before the age of 1. That's pretty awful. William Blake, who was an English poet, described a lot of these working conditions in the factories as being dark, satanic mills. So the working conditions were awful, and you complained about it, they just replaced you with somebody else. So it's not like you had workers' comp or anything like, where you get injured on the job. They just get rid of you and replace you with somebody else. A lot of the cities were overcrowded. They lived in like tenements or apartments, which were sometimes 12 by 10 rooms, and you might have like 5-6 families living together, like one room or something ridiculous. So overcrowding was bad. Sexual promiscuity was bad. A lot of filth, of course, produced a lot of disease. Cholera, typhus, and other diseases were quite common, like a lot of these slums. Factories produce a lot of pollution, like in the air, in the water. And so people's average life expectancy was very low, especially depending on what your type of, occupation was. And crime rates, it's another thing too. With urbanization came crime rates as well. So it increased a lot of crime rates in the cities. Like in Great Britain in 1805, crimes numbered about 4,600. In 1850, 30,000. So obviously urbanization leads to more crime rates as a whole. So there's a lot of negative aspects of, of the Industrial Revolution that does occur. And but over time, like I said, things do get better, but it just takes a long time for that to happen. And so that's part of why, if you study about the 19th century, they had the rise of socialism that happened about mid-19th century. Socialism was a type of political, economic, and social system where they were trying to improve the workers and their rights, and they also wanted to have the means to control a lot of the production, means of production, the industry, and it's either like, I guess the theories about socialism is that it's either controlled by the workers themselves or by the industries themselves, or even the state. There's been debated about what it is. There's no really defining definition of what socialism really is. Like if you look up socialism, there's all kinds of definitions that actually, define what it is. And there's different types of socialism, which I'll kind of get into later, which kind of confuses it even more. But yeah, there's this idea that maybe either the people or the government control, like the ownership, the means of production, control the factories, the mines, the railroads, in general, things like that. And it was kind of, opposite of capitalism, where capitalism is more or less running on its own, with maybe a lack of, regulations in general. Capitalism tends to be more pro-individualism, people wanting to make money as one of the main catalysts of it, rather than trying to help people out in general. Now, early socialism started in France. You can go back to like the French Revolution period and all that. So all the early socialists were mostly French overall. The early socialists in France were called Utopian socialists. They mostly developed probably in the, I guess, by the early 1800s, about when a lot of them lived the most overall. And I guess I'll give you three that were famous. Henry de Saint-Simon was considered, I think, the first one who's very famous. Saint-Simon, of course, was the one that coined the term socialism originally, so I guess early 1800s. And he basically rejected the idea of liberal individualism, which was part of, I guess, early industrialization with capitalism overall. And so he was the earliest influence overall. And a lot of these utopian socialists wanted to create utopian-like societies where people would live together like in a commune, or as Robert Owen would say, a cooperative. And so that's primarily what they looked at. Another guy was Charles Fourier, or Fourier, because I pronounce it actually Fourier. And Fourier was another French guy that was a utopian socialist. He wanted to give like equality for like women, like women's rights, which had I think been talked about as far back as Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Fourier was what they think the one that originally coined the term feminism originally. And I talk about Robert Owen. He was another one. He was actually Welsh from Britain. And Owen, like I said, developed cooperatives that dealt with like factories in general. He was a factory owner himself. And he wanted to develop like factories and mills where they would have like these cooperative towns where people would live together and, you know, as workers and produce cloth as a community. So he actually did that. Like in Indiana, he kind of experimented with that place called New Harmony, which was like a type of cooperative. And a lot of people that worked for these were called Owenites. So a lot of these utopian societies kind of came about afterwards. I think in America they had other ones you may have heard of called Oneida that was popular. So the whole idea was to kind of centralize everything, and the government, economics, and so on would be controlled by the workers themselves. Then you had Karl Marx. Marx, of course, famous German philosopher, socialist. Of course, one of the most famous socialists associated with the 19th century, with early socialism. And Marx came up with more of a scientific version of socialism, which is now called Marxism. And Marx was interested in the study of not just economics, but history and how it affected people. And also, Marx was concerned a lot with the class struggle between the different social classes in general. That's one of the main things that differs, I guess, Marxists from utopian socialists, is that the utopian socialists didn't think there was any class warfare, you know, kind of going on and all that. Marx was originally from Germany. I think his parents or grandparents were originally Jewish. They later converted to Christianity. And anyway, Marx, by 1848, became famous for producing a pamphlet with another fellow socialist named Frederick Engels, which is called the Communist Manifesto. Of course, the Communist Manifesto is probably one of the most famous works that he produced, besides Des Capital, which you may have heard of. And anyway, that particular pamphlet was instrumental in being considered, I guess, the main basis for a lot of the socialist ideas in Marxism. And of course, as you know, Marx is considered to be the father of communism and all that. Now, talk a little about the Communist Manifesto and some of its theories overall. Marx believed that originally that the different social classes that existed, like say what we call the capitalists or industrialists, and those are the workers that are earning the wages, a lot of that was produced because of the decline of feudalism in Europe. I think a lot of that goes back to the Black Death, which killed off a lot of people, millions of people, like in Europe. And so it led to the rise of wage earners overall. So you had to start paying people instead of through serfdom. And so that led to the rise of these wage earners. And then you had the bourgeoisie, which were the people that owned the businesses that they started working for. And Marx believed that what would happen is that you'd have these two different social classes, the haves and the have-nots, which the haves were the bourgeoisie or capitalists, and the have-nots, of course, were those that are the wage earners, what he called the proletariat overall. And anyway, Marx believed that over time, kind of like a wealth gap would be created over time, where the upper class would get more wealthier and the workers would get poorer. And Marx believed in this idea, a lot of the Marxists believed in this idea of the whole workers' revolution, where the proletariats would overthrow the bourgeoisie or capitalists, and they would create a socialist type state, which would then become communistic over time. And Marx envisioned an idea of where they would have a classless, stateless society. That was the end goal, really, of communism, what it is. But you look at communist states later, they don't really get to that. It's more like a proletarian type, socialist type state, which is more totalitarian. But that's what he originally envisioned with it. So they never really got to that. And of course, he made the statement at the end of the Communist Manifesto where he said, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose with their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all the countries unite." You know, that was the big slogan, I guess, of the socialists and all of that. And of course, it didn't. There's different theories about what happened to this. Like depends on what part of Europe you're talking about in the world. There's different types of socialism that kind of emerged from that later. Of course, in Germany, they would first develop what they call social democracy, which social democracy, like in the 1800s originally, was a type of socialism that was based off of they still had capitalism, but it was more off of welfare programs, where I think some people call it welfare capitalism. It's kind of a mixed economy between socialism and capitalism, and they use more like democracy to develop like socialism rather than, say, a workers' type revolution. This becomes popular in Germany, Britain, France, Scandinavia, etc. That's pretty much the more popular model, of course, of socialism that we know today. Welfare capitalism is usually the term they sometimes call it. And then, of course, they had the one that everybody dreads, they talk about, which is, of course, communism, state communism, which developed more like in the Soviet Union. You see it in China, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, etc. Of course, that version in, of course, the Soviet Union, which is Russia, became Marxism-Leninism, which that was kind of like a version where they kind of mixed some of Marxist theory with the theories of like Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, of course, was a famous Bolshevik, which was the Social Democrats that took over the Russia after the Russian Civil War ended. And anyway, they developed the Soviet Union, which was founded in 1922. And that was considered the first, I guess, major socialist state you really have that's communist. Their version, of course, of socialism is more of a state-type socialism where everything is pretty much socialist. Not just the government, but the economy is pretty much controlled from the top down. And some people call it like a proletarian-type socialism as a whole. And, of course, it didn't work out well. Stalin took it over later, and he collectivized everything, and that led to mass deaths in the country. And communism itself has killed a lot of people. I think like 100 million people have died because of communism overall. So people do have a lot of negative, attitudes about socialism sometimes, because as soon as they think of socialism, they think of, communist states like the Soviet Union that was around. The Chinese killed a lot of people too, like Mao Zedong, with a lot of their collectivization too, did the same thing as well. So a lot of those communist states, like the Soviet Union, eventually failed over time. Although in China they still have communism, but it's becoming more like capitalism the way it's going over there right now. Why did socialism fail in some places? Why did it not take off as much? At least the communism aspect didn't really take off because a lot of it had to do with like a combination of political legislation and also the rise of the middle class as a whole. Like in Britain with the Labour Party, they made a lot of reforms for the middle class, like the right to vote was a big thing, that happened in political power. Like the Reform Bill of 1832 is probably considered one of the greatest things they developed, which gave the right to vote to people, especially in the middle class as a whole. This also gave representation to the industrial areas of Britain as a whole. People's Charter of 1838 gave universal suffrage to all males in Britain. So it didn't matter what social class you were, you could vote as a whole. Women would get the right to vote, but it wouldn't be till like around World War I, the suffragette movement, and all that. 10-Hour Act of 1847 in Britain also limited the amount of hours you could work in a week, which was 10 hours, and over time it, obviously was reduced to 8 hours. It's been the norm later on. So that was definitely it. Also, like I said, a rise in the middle class has a lot to do with too why socialism probably hadn't taken off as much, like say in the United States. And the United States does have a vibrant middle class that kind of prevents, I think, socialism, because I think to have socialism kind of like, especially communism, like say in Venezuela and all that, you almost have to have a kind of a huge gap between the wealthy and the lower class with hardly any middle class, overall. But anyway, that's it for this podcast, part one. Part two later, which is will be later this week, will be I'll be talking more about the rise of nationalism, dealing with unification movements like in Italy and Germany being the big ones, and then I'll also talk about the cause of World War I. We'll be getting into like the 20th century soon, and so I'll get into like why World War I broke out and what the many causes of it was. So that's it for this history podcast.